So I think it's safe to say that the reality of death is something we're all going to have to face, okay, and the loss of those we love. There's no perfecting this place. I mean, even if you play your game perfectly, okay, and you become as healthy as a vampire, if you just live long enough, you are going to witness the death of everyone you love. At a certain point, the phone is just going to start ringing with bad news. Even our memories are precarious. My daughter is 3.5 years old, and I'm astonished at how much of her life I've forgotten. To see a video of her taken a year ago is to be astonished at how unfamiliar it is. I mean, she's a completely different person now. So there's no satisfying way to hold on to the past. In fact, when we look closely, there's no unsatisfying way of doing it either. We are locked in the present moment. A memory is a thought arising in the present. We are locked in the present moment with our thoughts and our iPads. So what does atheism have to offer people in this circumstance? People like ourselves, and people more fearful and self-deceived than us. That great body of humanity that recoils at the mere suggestion that a first-century carpenter may not be able to hear their thoughts, much less answer their prayers. Well, atheism as mere disbelief in God doesn't have much to offer. It's a corrective to a whole raft of bad ideas, but it doesn't put anything in place of bad ideas. It's a necessary corrective, but what fills the void is science and art and philosophy. Atheism is just a way of clearing the space for better conversations. And the problem we face, of course, is a problem of convincing the better part of humanity to have those better conversations. And this is a political problem. It's a scientific problem. It's an interpersonal problem. It's a problem of education. But the problem is that most people, most of the time, are desperate to believe ridiculous and divisive ideas for patently emotional reasons. And while rarely explicit, what they're really worried about is death. And when we're arguing about teaching evolution in the schools, I would argue that we are really arguing about death. It seems to me the only reason why any religious person cares about evolution is because if their holy books are wrong about our origins, they are very likely wrong about our destiny after death. So when you say to someone that you're a fool for not believing in evolution, or a fool to think the universe is 6,000 years old, I think that gets translated as you're a fool to think that your daughter who died in a car accident is really in heaven with God. And that is a very different communication. Before I can get to the end of this sentence, something unforeseen and terrible will happen to somebody somewhere. And we will read about it in the newspaper tomorrow. The question is, how can people close to these tragedies make sense of them? And religion provides an answer for that. It's an unjustified answer. It's a bad answer. It's an answer that comes with a host of other liabilities, because one being that it has birthed a many competing and irreconcilable answers, and therefore religious conflict and political tribalism seem impossible to overcome. But religion does provide an answer that most people think they need. And the schism among secularists, the fact that so many people at this conference are regularly attacked for criticizing religion, follows from this point. And people are worried about the grief of other people. The scientists and journalists who have made a career out of attacking the so-called new atheists are worried about the grief of other people. If your child dies in a car accident, believing that she is now in heaven with Jesus has to be consoling. It has to be consoling in a way that no other belief can be. It's true that there's a shadow side to this kind of thinking. I've heard from people who've suffered tragedies like this in the context of their faith and found that the belief in an afterlife was actually a way for their friends not to connect with their grief. And in fact, to grieve too much in such a circumstance is tantamount to, it's a little embarrassing. It's a sign that you lack faith. I mean, what are you really grieving about? If you think that the one you love most in this world is now in a better place, and you're going to be rejoined with her in the twinkling of an eye. But I think we can admit that atheism doesn't offer real consolation on this point. And that's not an accident. I mean, if you're open to new evidence, there's no guarantee that the revisions in your worldview are going to be consoling. You know, when you lose Santa Claus, what you get in his place is not as fun. You know, the sight of your parents maxing out their credit cards and wrapping presents in their pajamas is not as consoling as the elves and the sleigh and the 8 tiny reindeer.
Sam, in The End of Faith, you chide scientists who believe that consciousness ends with death. So, picking up a little bit on what David said, you wrote, the place of consciousness in the natural world is very much open to question. The truth is we simply do not know what happens after death. To my mind, this very much leaves the door open for a belief in the afterlife.
Yeah, although it doesn't make the traditional beliefs in the afterlife any more plausible. It's not the point I was making there. But it does, that point of not knowing what happens after death is what worries me about this conversation. I've been very worried about this, that all of you have given up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday evening only to hear the 4 of us tell you every which way that we have no idea what happens after death. Well, I expressed the spirit of my wife, and she was actually able to put me at ease. I'm worried, obviously, about boring all of you, and she said, nothing Hitchens does is ever boring. So I have that going for me. Right. I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. We'll talk about the plausible versions of it and how implausible some of the traditional ones are. But I think, just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Okay, year after year after year. I mean, that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days, killing only children before the age of 5. I mean, think about these children. Think about their parents. Know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be saved. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality and as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence we are going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that, and I think, therefore, this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes wins. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, that the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility. So that's...
Well, I think the one thing to notice is that the dialogue between science and religion has gone this way. It has been one of relentless and one-directional erosion of religious authority. I would challenge anyone here to think of a question upon which we once had a scientific answer, however inadequate, but for which now the best answer is a religious one. Now you can think of an uncountable number of questions that run the other way, where we once had a religious answer, and now the authority of religion has been battered and nullified by science and by moral progress and secular progress generally. And I think that's not an accident. And the one area where religion still seems to hold its ground is now under assault by science, and it's very good that it is under assault by science. And this is the whole issue of morality and human happiness and what constitutes the good life. These are, and let me just tell you why I think this is a scientific question. Even the place of science is ultimately a scientific question. Because surely there are objective facts to be learned about the basis of human happiness. The moment you recognize that morality and spirituality and value is a matter of happiness and suffering, and that we're moving suffering in the direction of happiness, then you realize that if there are objective facts to know about human happiness, and surely there are, facts about the way that genes and ideas and uses of attention and economic systems, social structures, all of these conspire to make us happy or miserable. And again, it's true that scientific discourse is just in the beginning of addressing these issues. But it's not too soon to say that love is better than hate in terms of ethics. And we are studying these things at the level of the brain. Eventually we will understand the brain basis of love and hate and the kinds of mechanisms, both cultural and personal, that ramify these states of mind. And there will be right and wrong answers, and we'll find, for instance, that honor killing is a bad strategy if you want to raise compassionate men. We know that already, but at some point we will know this biochemically. So unlike religious people, we atheists really have a good reason to make the most of life, to make the most of the present moment. Because even if you live to be 100, there are just not that many days in life. So what is the point of life? I mean, is anything sacred? Does such a question even make sense? This is what religious people are worried about. And I think these questions do make sense, and there are answers to them. But the answers are not a matter of getting more information. The answer is a change in attitude. There are ways of experiencing life as sacred without believing anything, and certainly without believing anything on insufficient evidence. There are ways to really live in the present moment. What's the alternative? It is always now. However much you feel you may need to plan for the future, to anticipate it, to mitigate risks, the reality of your life is now. Now, this may sound trite. This may sound perilously close to what Dan called deepity in his talk. But it's the truth. It's not quite true as a matter of physics. In fact, there is no now that encompasses the entire universe. You can't talk of an event being simultaneously occurring here and one at the same moment occurring in Andromeda. The truth is, now is not even well defined as a matter of neurology, because we know that inputs to the brain come at different moments, and that consciousness is built upon layers of inputs whose timings have to be different. You could just consider the sensation of touching your finger to your nose. It seems simultaneous as a matter of conscious experience, but we know that the input from the finger to sensory cortex must take longer than the input from your nose. And this is true no matter how short your arms or long your nose. So the brain buffers these inputs in some way in memory, and then promotes the seeming simultaneity to consciousness. And so our conscious awareness of the present moment is, in some relevant sense, already a memory. But as a matter of conscious experience, the reality of your life is always now. And I think this is a liberating truth about the nature of the human mind. In fact, I think there's probably nothing more important to understand about your mind than that, if you want to be happy in this world. The past is a memory. It's a thought arising in the present. The future is merely anticipated. It is another thought arising now. Okay, what we truly have is this moment and this. And we spend most of our lives forgetting this truth, repudiating it, fleeing it, overlooking it. And the horror is that we succeed. We manage to never really connect with the present moment and find fulfillment there because we are continually hoping to become happy in the future. And the future never arrives. Now, even when we think we're in the present moment, we're in very subtle ways always looking over its shoulder, anticipating what's coming next. We are always solving a problem. And it's possible to simply drop your problem, if only for a moment, and enjoy whatever is true of your life in the present. Now, again, as you can see, the line between timeless wisdom and banality is a little difficult to find. And I'm a little worried that some of you have begun to gag on what seems like New Age pablum. And you must know that I don't want to stand in front of 4,000 atheists and do my best impression of Lao Tzu. And so,
I would just add one thing. This kind of question is still scientifically tractable. Reasonably serious people have tried to study the near-death experience. And this idea of consciousness somehow rising, dissociating from the body and rising to a point above the operating theater and looking down on the body, the phenomenology there is common enough that people seem to think that this is testable. And so some people have put random number generators on the top of cabinets in the operating theater, just on the odd chance that someone comes back saying, I saw this weird digital readout above your cabinets, and it was 35721. That would be very interesting. Now, no one to my knowledge has done that, but if people, this is something we could set up this experiment in advance. It wouldn't be merely anecdotal.
Have they put shoes up there? Because sometimes that...
Well, it's obviously structured along the same lines, but again, there's a reason why we can't make a research program based on that one shoe.
This model of a landscape also admits of the possibility of what we call spiritual or mystical experience. I think that there's no question that the human mind is capable of having remarkable self-transcending experiences, and many of which can be very hard-won, many of which you have to have a talent, perhaps, to access, and certainly training to access. And many positive social emotions that we all experience can be brought to a much higher register than we bring them. I mean, something like compassion or empathy. I used to be in the habit of saying that undoubtedly there's a Tiger Woods of compassion out there. For obvious reasons, that analogy doesn't work so well at the moment. But I think compassion is best thought of as a skill. It's clearly trainable. It's clearly something that people have to a greater or lesser degree. And we're beginning to understand the neurology of both its appearance and its encouragement. Our minds are, to a significant degree, plastic. I mean, you sort of become what you pay attention to. And this is something a maturing science of the human mind really can put us in a position to understand. How many of you recognize this photo? This is a photo of apparently very happy Nazis. You can't quite make it out. This is from a book that's now called the Auschwitz album. There was a photo album that was discovered in an attic somewhere of just Nazis having a gay old time. And it took some research to figure out who they were and what they were doing. These were people working at Auschwitz during the peak of its productivity as a factory of death. And this was they were at a kind of a chalet that was a few kilometers from the death camp. So this is more or less their mood as they were listening to accordion music and lying in the sun and eating blueberries under the plume of human ash coming out of the crematory of Auschwitz. Now, there's nothing about my view of the moral landscape or the link I'm drawing between morality and human well-being that insists that I deny the obvious happiness of these people. I mean, I don't think they're fake smiles that we see there. I think these are, and I don't think these people are psychopaths. I think for the most part these are normal people who would go home and pet their dogs and cats, and they love their children, and they would listen to Wagner and shed a tear. The problem with these people was not that they had a radically different conception of morality. They have a moral circle that they had radically delimited. They had put most of humanity outside the sphere of their moral concern. And that's what we continually run into in the world. Based on some divisive dogmatism, we run into groups of people who just manage to put the better part of humanity, or significant groups of humanity, outside the theater of their moral concern.
While I always use words like spiritual and mystical in scare quotes, and I try to denude them of metaphysics, my email suggests that many of my brothers and sisters in arms find my interest in these topics problematic. So I want to go into this in a little bit of detail. First, let me just describe the general phenomenon I'm talking about. A person, in whatever culture he finds himself, one day notices that life is difficult. He notices that in the best of times, even in the best of times, no one close to him has died. There are no hostile armies massing in the distance. The fridge is stocked with beer, and the weather is just so. Even when things are going as well as they can go, he notices that at the level of his attention, moment to moment, he is seeking happiness and only finding temporary relief from his search. And we've all noticed this, and we seek pleasant sights and sounds and tastes and sensations and attitudes. We become connoisseurs of art and music and literature. But our pleasures are, by their very nature, fleeting. I mean, the best we can do is merely reiterate them as often as we are able. If we enjoy some great professional success, this remains vivid and intoxicating to us for about an hour, maybe a day. But then people begin to ask you, well, what are you going to do next? You know, don't you have something in the pipeline? Steve Jobs releases the iPhone. I'm sure it wasn't 20 minutes before someone came up to him and said, when are you going to make this thing smaller? Now, notice at this juncture, very few people say, oh, I'm done. I've met all my goals, and now I'm just going to stay here and eat ice cream until I die in front of you. Even when things have gone as well as they can go, the search for happiness, the effort required to keep boredom and dissatisfaction and doubt at bay continues. At the very least, death and the loss of loved ones interrupts regularly even the most well-ordered and gratifying life. So in this context, many people have begun to wonder whether or not a different form of well-being, a deeper form of well-being exists, a form of well-being that is not contingent upon merely reiterating one's pleasures and avoiding one's pains. Is there a form of happiness that is not contingent upon always having one's favorite food available to be placed on one's tongue, or having one's friends and family within arm's reach, or having good books to read, or having something to look forward to on the weekend? Is it possible to be happy before anything happens, before one's desires get gratified, in the very midst of life's vicissitudes, in the very midst of old age, disease, and death? Now, I think this question lies at the periphery of everyone's consciousness. But we are all, in some sense, living our answer to this question. And many of us are living as though the answer is no. No, there is nothing more profound than seeking satisfaction, moment to moment. There's nothing more profound than reiterating your pleasures, sensory, emotional, intellectual. So many of us are living as though there's nothing to do but just keep our foot on the gas until we run out of road.
But your mind is all you have. Okay, it's all you've ever had. It's all you have to offer other people. Okay, and this might sound callous to say when there may be many other aspects of your life that seem in need of being addressed. When you're struggling to find a career, or you're sick, but it's still true. I mean, if you are perpetually angry and depressed and confused and unloving, it doesn't matter how much success you have or who is in your life, you're not going to enjoy any of it. I suspect you could all make a list of things you want to accomplish, of things that really need to be changed about your life. What is the significance of everything on that list? Each thing on that list seems to promise that if you could only do it, you would have reason to just be happy in the present moment. We are all trying to find a path back to the present moment, and good enough reason to just be happy here. And the practice of meditation I just showed you, often called mindfulness meditation, is just a trick for doing that. It's a trick for setting aside your to-do list, if only for a few moments, and actually locate a feeling of fulfillment in the present. And again, I'm not saying that everything on your list is absurd or not worth accomplishing. But how dissatisfied with the present do you have to be in order to prepare a satisfying future? How neurotic do you have to be? How unhappy do you have to be? How much stress do you have to feel? How unpleasant do you have to be for other people to be around? But if you're constantly ruminating about what you just did, or what you should have done, or what you would have done if you only had the chance, you will miss your life. You'll fail to connect with it. You'll fail to connect with other people. I mean, when other people talk, you'll be waiting for them to shut up so that you can say what's on your mind to say. I mean, even when you don't have an opportunity to talk, in a moment like this, when you just need to listen, the conversation as an automaticity continues. You have a voice in your head that keeps saying things. Haven't you noticed? The conversation we have with ourselves every minute of the day comes at a cost. I'm not saying that discursive thought is not necessary or useful, but it is the mechanism by which most of our suffering is inflicted, the sorrow and the self-doubt and the anxiety and the fear, and yes, the fear of death. Thinking is useful, but being perpetually lost in thought isn't. Okay, but being the mere hostage of the next thought that comes careening into consciousness isn't useful. So if there's an antidote to the fear of death and the experience of loss, that's compatible with reason, I think it's to be found here. The purpose of life is pretty obvious. We are constantly, why do we create culture and form relationships? Beyond matters of mere survival. We are constantly trying to create and repair a world that our minds want to be in. And we, alone among humanity, for the most part, have realized that religion is a bad way to do that. Okay, so we have to start a new conversation. Thank you very much.